So I just found out that apparently all of you hate my favorite science fiction books. And I'm not angry, but I am disappointed. So today I'm going to be talking about science fiction books that I really like that have low ratings on Goodreads. So apparently the average person does not enjoy these books. I'm going to be discussing some of them here, hopefully catching your attention for something that is an unpopular opinion, but maybe you'll enjoy as well. And all that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about Supernova ERA. This is a book written by the same author who wrote The Three-Body Problem. So I think a lot of people picked up this book thinking it was going to be similar to those and that trilogy. And unfortunately it is not. In the story, it is set in a world where everyone over, I believe, the age of 13 is going to die in the near future. They know this is coming, and so what they do is the parents and leaders of the world prepare the children to run the world themselves. So we follow them during that preparation, and then the vast majority of this book takes place after, when the children are left alone in charge of this new found world. And this is just a crazy book that requires a huge suspension of disbelief, which is probably where a lot of people got lost. And within the story, basically we follow a bunch of sociopathic children who have taken over the world, and you get to see what the world would be like if it was run by terrible children. So I can imagine why this book is so disliked. It's, again, ridiculous in terms of a premise, and you read about some very unlikable, horrible children. But I kind of enjoyed it because of all those reasons. Sure, you have to just go along with the basic premise and just assume that it somehow makes sense from a scientific perspective, even though it doesn't. But from there, it just makes for this wild ride. It's almost like a battle royale style, where you just see these children being left to their own devices without a parent or a moral code to follow, and they just do terrible things to each other. So I really enjoyed it, but it definitely is kind of up my alley of messed up books in a way that probably isn't what everyone was looking for when they picked this one up. So I get it. I still love it. Hopefully some of you will too. Next, let's talk about VN by Madeline Ashby. This is the first book in a trilogy following an artificial intelligent character who has some organic qualities. Right at the beginning of the story, something malfunctions and they end up consuming their own grandmother. And then from there, of course, the humans panic that this person, or this being rather, has lost their fail-safes, and so this character has to go on the run where everyone is chasing them, wanting to shut them down. This is just a bizarre premise, which once again, I do understand why people would pick up this book and go, this is not for me. A book that starts out with a young girl eating her grandmother is a strange place to start. I get that. This book, although it is marketed as being adult, also has a feeling of being young adult in the fact that the character is very much coming into their own. They are very naive and sheltered, and that changes very quickly as they have to experience the world around them. I picked up this book the first time, and I'll be honest, I didn't totally get it, and then I got a chance to reread it and review it as a full trilogy and ended up really falling in love with it. So I love this trilogy, but I do get it. It's very off-kilter. It takes a traditional and popular narrative of artificial intelligence gone wrong and has a different spin on it. It kind of plays with the tropes, but in my mind, the author really takes a sidestep and avoids some of the basic cliches you're expecting and goes in some really bizarre directions that, again, I love, but maybe aren't to everyone else's taste. The next one really shocks me, and that is No Effect Gloss by Essa Hansen, which has a fairly low ratings on Goodreads. I will admit, when I first picked this book up for review, I did have criticisms of it, which I still will stand by today. If you don't know, this is a story that is a space opera. We follow a young boy who, right at the beginning of the story, he is a slave, and his slave planet basically goes through a purge where they get rid of all of the human beings. He has to run and survive and ends up being picked up by a ship, a group of salvagers that take him away. Within this first book, we follow this, once again, very naive character at the beginning who knows nothing of the larger world and is brought into this group, this found family, and they slowly teach him. There is a major shift within the story because, and it's not really a spoiler, but some of you be aware that the character ages up throughout the story very quickly. So they are physically aged up without having the mental acuity to match. So they're very much a young boy in this man's body, and because of that, it makes for a strange story where I just want to shake the character and tell him to grow up. And it does make sense that he's so naive, but it is a little bit irritating to read. I also will admit that the book, my criticisms of it the first time I reviewed it, is the fact that as a space opera, it's very tropey, cliche. You hear me using the words found family and salvagers, all of that. However, if you continue on with the series, it just gets better. The world building gets so much more rich and interesting and unique. week, and it definitely matures up. The main character matures up. There's a lot of darker themes that continue in the later books, and I ended up loving this trilogy. And I really encourage people, if they're not quite sold on book one, please keep going. It just gets better. While this first book is not perfect, it still was a solid start to a new series, a classic space opera, and I just don't understand why it doesn't get more love online. Next up is The Stars Undying by Anne-Marie Robin, and this is a book that is a science fiction queer retelling of Cleopatra and Alexander. And this is one that I don't, again, fully understand why it has such low ratings. I think it's really one where the expectations led certain people to pick up this book that probably weren't the target audience. So I know when I picked up this book, I expected it to be this epic love story between Cleopatra and Alexander. And at least in this first book, it's really not what it is. Instead, Cleopatra is very young, and the story mirrors historical events where Alexander helped to liberate her as she was put in a different position and really lost her power. So it's the beginnings of what would become their relationship and focuses on a time period of Egyptian history that I wasn't really familiar with. And of course, again, this book is set in the backdrop of a space opera, so it is all science fiction and new technology. And so I think people picked up this book maybe wanting those Egyptian feels, that heavy romance, and all the things that this book is not. It's very slow paced, it's very focused again on that historical retelling, and again, a part of history that you'll have a lot of lay people, myself included, weren't really familiar with. I definitely had to go back and do some reading myself to really understand the context of this book. Once I understood that, I appreciate this book a lot more, ended up really enjoying it. I believe it was a favorite of the year, but it was not what I expected, which so often I say is the big kicker or killer when it comes to marketing, is that if people pick up a book expecting it to be one thing and it turns out to be another, a lot of people are disappointed, and you'll see that in their book ratings. Next, we have The Terraformers by Annalise Newitz, and this is a story that follows a woman who works as a terraformer. She is working on this planet called Sasky with her pet moose, and within this planet she finds out that there are possibly people living there that they weren't aware of and has to deal with the consequences of this. So this is a book that I think is very smart. It plays with a lot of ideas and concepts surrounding colonialism, and it's just a really good complement to perhaps the classics of the colonization subgenre, so things like Red Mars. And so it kind of plays a what if of us going in there and just taking over and reforming this planet and the moral consequences of that. And so I think it's a really smart book. This is one I admit that I kind of like a little bit more intellectually than had a really good time reading, which I do understand, of course, that I do it too, where I will rate books based off my enjoyment of the story as well as how well it accomplishes what it's trying to do. I think I was biased with this book because, as you can probably tell from some of those references, it's making a lot of nods to Canadian places and Canadian concepts and cultural items and all of that. So when you bring in a pet moose, I am just immediately sold on a book in a way that definitely makes me a little bit more subjective in my rating. So this author in all of her work tends to bring in a lot of Canadianisms, which definitely softens me up to their work. So I think this one is good. I actually do kind of understand why it's not beloved. I don't think it has mass appeal if you aren't a hardcore science fiction fan and don't really want to consider the nuances of this subgenre. I think that is not the most accessible place to start, but I do think it does what it's trying to do very well, and I really appreciate a book that goes there and writes just a smart, witty story like this. Next up, we have The Ghost Line, which is written by Andrew Neil Gray and J.S. Herbison. And this is a novella I have talked about on my channel for years if you haven't caught those previous reviews. Basically, this is a science fiction story that mirrors the focus or structure of a haunted house story. So we follow these married salvagers that go on to this ship, this luxury liner that has been abandoned. And when they go there, possibly something is wrong, possibly it is haunted, and they have to explore it from there. I think this is just a great story that focuses around a married couple getting to have an emphasis on their relationship, as the authors themselves are married, so they tie that in. I love the idea of a haunted house story a lot more than reading really traditional ones. So I like something that takes the structure of it and then does something new, bringing it into space and making its own story. It's definitely more atmospheric than horror, so I always try to pitch it that way. And it just has low ratings, and I'm not sure if it's because people don't like that relationship focus in the book or because they want to be punchier. They want like a zombie jumping out of the closet of the spaceship or something that is not trying to do in this book. So I don't know if it's expectations, if it's more about the climax not being as punchy as people would like, but I think this book is really beautiful. I've been recommending it for years. If you want to dabble into space horror without getting into something truly scary, this one is a great place to check out. I just think it's smart and sweet and I like it, so hopefully you do too. Next is The Archive Undying, a book I've talked about before on my channel and is always so hard to describe. It's a piece of god punk that is set in a world where there are these god robots that rule over cities. At the beginning of the story, one of them goes mad, starts to destroy everything. However, in the act of doing so, it ends up waking up this person who has been in this comatose-like state, and the story goes from there. This is one I think is the fact that it is a fictional story that is technically science fiction in nature, but as soon as you get into something like godpunk, where you have artificial intelligence that reign over like gods, a story like this just becomes very fantastical, and I think it's hard to find its right audience. This is a book that I've often compared to other fantasy books, and I do think that you are more likely to enjoy this book if you love some of the more lyrical fantasy books out there. It's very focused on a queer relationship, which again I think is something you see more in a fantasy style narrative, as opposed to a science fiction book that is grounded perhaps in technology and ideas and scientific theory. You're not going to get that with this book. This book also has some really hazy world building. I enjoy spending time in the story even if I don't quite understand what is happening. It's like the author imagined a great world but had trouble expressing it fully to the reader, so I never felt like I really could put my finger on exactly how everything worked within the world, and I don't know entirely how intentional that choice was. That being said, I still had a great time reading it. There's something about godpunk that just really works well for me, and I like this one, and it was just a time where I went along with the story. I understood that it wasn't hard science fiction, and so I didn't set it up to have those expectations. I knew it was just going to be what it is, and instead just had a great time reading it. I think it again appealed perhaps a little bit more to my love of fantasy than science fiction, but was it weird and out of the box, and I definitely want more. Highly recommend if you're the right audience for something like this. Next, let's talk about Daikonauts by Greg Egan, and really I could have used any Greg Egan book because they all consistently have fairly low reviews and ratings, and I think it's the fact that they are really hard, mind-bending science fiction that does not hold the reader's hands. So if you want accessible science fiction, if you are starting out, do not start with Greg Egan. Even if you are someone who reads plenty of the genre, I still think that he's one of the toughest cookies out there in terms of an author. He just doesn't hold anything back and isn't afraid to make the reader completely confused and just go over their head. If you can't keep up with him, he's not slowing down for your benefit. This story in particular deals with some geometric ideas and concepts that again went over my head. The beginning itself is very much mind spinning, where you have the characters that are moving this building, but they are shifting it in a way that is just not the way you would expect it to, and you just have to read the story for yourself. I would only recommend this one to those of you like myself that love really heavy science fiction stories. Even if they are complex, you enjoy almost being confused by your science fiction. You like books that challenge you and kind of expand your mind in those ways. Again, if you're a newbie, this is not the place to start. I never want to be gatekeeping, but I just don't think you're going to have a great time with this one, and I would encourage you to read other things first and get your footing in the genre before moving on to something like this. So I really get why people would give this book a poor rating. If I had to rate this book on my comprehension of it, I would have had to give it a pretty low rating myself. I enjoyed it, but man, was it confusing. We also have the story of Vagabonds, and this is a story translated from Chinese where we follow an exchange of students. There are those living on Earth that go to live on Mars and vice versa, and now they're coming back home. You find out that this is set in a future where, of course, humanity has expanded towards Mars, but then there has been a break and there was a point of silence or lack of communication between these two groups, and they were just at a standstill, and now they are trying to build that bridge again and have this exchange program and try to kind of share ideas because of the fact that they have been so separated. This is a story where you have two very different cultures with very different feelings and beliefs surrounding their feelings of the individual versus society. I think it's a very topical book, particularly one written in China, so it very much, in my mind, is a reference or call to the differences between traditional Western and Eastern philosophies regarding governance and all of that. And I think the book is incredibly smart in what it does. There are parts of this book that I loved, but it's very long, and in my mind this book would have really benefited from being cut down. So while I really enjoyed parts of this book, I'm also in the group that I love this book, but I would have loved it a lot more if it had been shorter because it felt very bloated, Really smart idea, really smart concept, but even I do struggle to recommend it to readers because I know, even for myself, I almost got lost in the weeds of the middle section. I love this book, but I recognize that not every reader is going to want to spend that long with a story like this. So I think it's incredibly smart. Wish it had been focused a little bit more, just because I think, again, it would have more all readers appeal with a tighter plot and narrative. And I also have The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey, and this is one, of course, that is a science fiction thriller where we follow a woman whose husband has moved on to another wife. There is elements of the story that in my mind are considered to be spoilers, and this is one that I really enjoyed, and I assume has lower ratings simply because it has a very heavy focus on a thriller element, so there is a twist and surprise to the story. And in my opinion, thrillers is one of the lowest rated genres on Goodreads because people's enjoyment of it very much depends on their suspension of disbelief, if they can go along with that twist. And if they can't, it all tends to really fall apart very quickly, and people give a lot of one-star reviews to endings and twists that they do not like. So this is one I do recommend. I thought it was very smart. I read a lot of thrillers. I can be very picky with thrillers, as we've discussed before. And this is one that I think is solid, well worth your time, and I hope you check it out. And finally, we have The Sleepless by Victor Magnibo. And this is a sci-fi thriller I've talked about before on my channel. It's set in a world where certain individuals lose the ability to sleep. And this is something that I've compared to that of Beggars in Spain, but in my mind this is a much better take because it really takes into account how our society treats sleep as an inconvenience, and the idea that those who are perhaps sleepless and can still function and do not require that sleep then would become some of the most productive individuals in society. They have more time for leisure, more time for work and making money, and all of those different areas of life, and so they are kind of upheld within society. And then there's also going to be a lot of prejudice against them for those that are perhaps normal sleepers that cannot get the advantages that they see in these sleepless. In terms of concept, I thought this one was really smart, and within the story, I haven't even mentioned yet, there is a whole mystery going on. There is a character who has died under mysterious circumstances, and we follow this character who is sleepless as they're trying to figure out what is happening. And this is a book that accomplishes in my mind both things I'm looking for, where there's a really interesting high concept idea in a science fiction novel and also a really cohesive plot. And so you put both together to create a story that is very compelling, easy to read, but has a lot of nuggets and things that the author or reader can consider as they are going through the narrative. So I thought this one was brilliant. I'll be honest, in this case, I really don't know why it is not more beloved. I think it should easily have a 4-star rating. I think it's very well done. I have no complaints with it. And I don't know why you all are rating it so low, because this book is great. So I can't even explain this one. Let's leave it there. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And if you have already read them, I'd love to know, did you love them or hate them, and why? Let's discuss in the comments, as long as we keep it spoiler free for everyone. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, horror, thrillers, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, you can drop a comment, even if it's just something like a spaceship, like an emoji, that's great. If you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.